I have to unmute myself. That might be a little bit helpful. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Happy Friday. Welcome to another episode of Wildland Stories. My name is Gabrielle and I'm your fearless host. My co-host, Darren McAvoy, is actually going to be put in the hot seat today, and we're going to grill him for information about all things biochar. Darren is an extension assistant professor at Utah State University. He earned his bachelor's in forestry from Colorado State University and his master's in communications from here at Utah State. He's been with USU Extension since 1999, and he founded the Utah Biomass Resources Group. Through the Utah Biomass Resources Group, he has partnered with various agencies to create biochar and reduce hazardous fuels on private and public land. So we're hoping to learn a few things from him today. Darren, thank you so much for letting me put you in the hot seat. How are you feeling today?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So are you ready to get started?
Yes, let's go.
Alrighty. So very first question is super basic here. What's biochar?
Essentially, it's charcoal. It's a new name for charcoal that was created perhaps 20 years ago. Charcoal that's intended to be used as a soil amendment and many other uses than just having a barbecue.
Wonderful. So what exactly is a soil amendment?
Well, a fertilizer is something that has nutrients in it, and a soil amendment like biochar doesn't necessarily have nutrients in it, but we add nutrients into it. I like to refer to biochar in your soil as like an empty sponge. So we add a bunch of, we add compost to it, and it soaks up the nitrogen and the other things from that compost. It makes it available to plants when we add it to soils.
Thank you. I actually want to jump back because I forgot to mention this. If anybody has questions throughout this, at the very end, we'll get to some of the questions you ask in here. Please put those in the Q&A box. It's impossible for me to sift through the chat box to find those. So please use the Q&A. So Darren, how did you get involved with making biochar? When did this passion start for you?
Well, in some ways, the passion started back when I started burning piles for the U.S. Forest Service as a firefighter, a wildland firefighter in the 1980s. And I burned a lot of piles, some as big as my house, and some days just run from piles to piles. So I've always kind of been looking for an alternative way to use some of that wood. And I didn't really start making biochar until I was asked to head up the biomass group in Utah by partners from the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management in about 2009. We started with a gasifier. We called it the Dragon Wagon, a machine that we drove around Utah and hosted Utah's first wood-fired concert. And it cooks the wood in the absence of oxygen at very high temperatures and turns it almost all into a gas, similar to propane. And we run a generator from that. And it made a little bit of biochar. And that's when I kind of first got started. But I think it's funny in this field when you get guys talking about it. They like to put their foot up on a stump and like they're standing around a campfire and strike a pose. And I've been in biochar since 1970. And in a way, I can say that because it was about maybe 1970, early 70s. I was about 10 years old and I had a garden, and my family allowed me to have it in this one little plot in the back of the property. And that was where until then, we always burned our trash. I think it must have been the Clean Air Act or something that made us stop burning our trash in the backyard, my older brother's duty. And so I had a garden in that biochar laden old trash burning pile. And so in some ways, I like to put my foot up on the stump and say, I've been in biochar and carbon since 1973, but really since about 2009.
Awesome. Do you remember what you grew in that little garden of yours?
Oh yeah, lots of tomatoes, carrots, radishes. It was a simple little garden, but it was a good way to get started.
That's so cool. I've never been very successful with gardens. I think I don't have the patience for it. So what kind of research is being done in biochar right now? Is this kind of like a new thing for people to research, or just what's going on in that world?
Well, the amount of research in the biochar world doubles every year for about the last 10 years. So it's a huge amount, more than I can even keep a handle on. Here at USU and projects that the Utah Biomass Resources Group has been involved with since 2009 includes biochar production using the gasifier or pyrolysis machines or simple kilns that we'll talk about more. But biochar applications. I'm not that much of a researcher, but I do a lot of applied and partner with a lot of people to help them do applied research. And we've made biochar from a lot of different things, and as crazy as extra fabric, old cotton, recycled fabric from New York City, old cotton and Dacron, that's actually made from wood. And we've done all sorts of research on how to use that char, putting it in soil, under irrigation pivots here in Utah, on alfalfa and corn, on Bureau of Land Management reclamation sites, old mining reclamation sites, trying to use it as a soil amendment to reclaim those. We've done some crazy things like feed it to sheep, and found that in a controlled study that we've published and with partners, and found that it increases the weight gain in lambs. They actually prefer it. And lots of other different applications to forest soils. We've grown tomatoes and melons, so the list goes on, and we're constantly looking into ways to use biochar. Oh, I should say we've researched using it as a way to pull out pharmaceuticals out of the water system that are unwanted. Yeah, the list goes on. Those are a few examples, though.
Thank you. So I'm getting some feedback that your camera is hard to watch. It's like auto focusing on you. I'm super sorry to interrupt you for that.
That's all right.
Can you go into your camera app and turn it off of autofocus?
I can try. So maybe I should stand more still. I'm not sure how to do that.
You could try sitting down.
Okay, I'll have to move my desk down.
Sorry, Darren, to throw you off like that. So while you're getting adjusted, why don't you just tell us a little bit about how and with what biochar is made?
Biochar can be made from any organic material, anything that's ever been living. As a forester, I focus mostly on making biochar from woody biomass, wood waste pretty much. And it's made by cooking the wood in the absence of oxygen. And sometimes it will appear that we're burning the wood, and in a lot of cases, it's just a portion of the wood that's burning. And most of the wood, or a lot of the wood down inside, is being cooked by that wood on the outside that's burning, and controlling the oxygen in that environment. And so that is how it is made.
So are there only certain species of trees that can be used to make biochar?
No, any woody species. We've made biochar from perhaps more than a dozen woody species in Utah. We focus a lot on pinyon and juniper because of our relationship with the Bureau of Land Management. But we've done most upland conifers, Doug fir, lodgepole, aspen. I've done biochar out of Russian olive and tamarisk and other invasive species such as that. And we've actually, with fancier kilns, we can make biochar out of Phragmites. That's an invasive swamp reed that's taken over big portions of the Great Salt Lake. As I mentioned, I've made it from excess fabric. Corn stover is a common biochar feedstock. And we've made it from crazy things such as excess tires and auto fluff. Those are not the kinds of chars that you would apply to your soil. You do other things with that. But with the more high-tech machines, we've made chars from about 30 different kinds of feedstock here in Utah.
Wow. So would you say that the quality of the biochar depends on what you use to make it?
Yes, and how you make it. And we like to say there's no such thing as there's not biochar, but there are biochars. And every biochar is different. And you can make a pretty crude biochar, which is a lot of what I focus on, simple ways of making biochar. But we talk about a world in the future where we have, and this is becoming true in some places, designer biochars, where you start with what your soil needs or what your trees or your crop needs, and you create a biochar to fill that need, to fix that need. And some ways you can manipulate that include the temperature that you make the biochar at, the residence time. If you have a high-tech biochar machine, you can control the amount of time, and that can change it. And the feedstocks, hardwood feedstock versus a softwood feedstock, or some of the other feedstocks that I mentioned.
Can you speak to, so what would the difference then be if we used a hardwood feedstock versus a softwood feedstock?
Yeah, well, one simple difference would be in the pH. If I remember correctly, a softwood pH biochar would likely have a higher pH, but that can also be modified by if you wash the biochar or quench it afterwards, and what you treat the biochar with.
So you mentioned pH, then will the pH of the biochar have an effect on the pH of the soil that you put it into?
Yes, it absolutely can. It's something that you have to pay attention to. I will often have my biochars tested at a lab. I tend to send them to a lab in California because that's where a lot of my partners use this particular lab, and that just provides me some consistency. But there's lots of labs around that can do that sort of thing, and they'll test all sorts of things. They'll tell you if there's arsenic or heavy metals, and generally there's not. One of the questions we have in the testing is how much carbon is in it, what percentage of the biochar is carbon, and that's essentially what it is. A high quality biochar is almost pure carbon, 90% carbon, but a low quality biochar, which is what I'm more focused on making now for simpler methods with simpler methods in the woods, that can be closer down to 60% carbon, and that's about the threshold where they still call it biochar when it's got about 60% carbon.
So I definitely want to get into carbon, but I'm going to save that for a little bit later. You mentioned a little while ago that you can make biochar on a smaller scale. So can people make biochar at home, and how would they do that?
Yeah, there's lots of different scales of biochar production, and I embrace all of them. I think there's room for all of them, from these big box kilns that I use out in the woods to with these 30-inch diameter logs and that sort of thing, all the way down to you could do it in a coffee can. A more practical way that a friend does here in town, he just has one of those fire rings that you buy at Lowe's or Home Depot for social gathering in the backyard, and he adds wood to that until it's kind of full of coals. It's kind of a bowl, and when it gets about 3/4 full of coals, he quenches it. He uses his garden hose to put a bunch of water on it, put that fire out, and stir it up, and there you have backyard biochar. Another friend here colleague here in Logan, one of the first introductions to biochar, the way he likes to do it is he'll take all of his wood trimmings from his yard and chip them and put that into a barrel, and put that barrel, it's got just he seals it except with a little hole in it to let some of the pressure off, the hole about the size of your finger, and he has a fire underneath it. He puts it on some posts and some cement blocks, and has a campfire underneath it outside, and that cooks the wood inside of that barrel and turns that into biochar. So there's many methods, crude application. And the one that I focus on a lot is one I learned from a partner in Oregon, Kelpie Wilson, who came to Utah in 2017 on a grant, who taught us some simple methods of biochar production with these boxes, these simple kilns called Oregon kilns or flame cap kilns. And they're about 5 foot by 5 foot. They look similar to the size of the back of a pickup bed, and they'll fit right in the back of a pickup bed. And we put branches and logs up to perhaps 10 inches in diameter in those in a certain way. We crisscross them in there to start with, and light it off and keep adding fuels. It's like tending a campfire. When you don't want to smother it, but as much as you can, you keep adding fuels. And same story, when it's about 3/4 full, we add water to it, about 100 gallons of water out in the woods, and stir it up, and then we have a simple biochar. And this is a way I sort of have, as a forester, I approach this and kind of market this in the last few years as a fuels reduction approach. As I mentioned, we burned a lot of piles in forestry, and that's still the cheapest way to do business. But here's an alternative way that can preserve some of that carbon and do some good for the air and for the soil.
So I know that some people will use biochar in their gardens at home. what are some other common uses that people are using biochar for?
That is by far the most common use. And that's what most folks are using it for at home. But another one is in the barn. A lot of stories and applications, people add it underneath the barn, especially during the winter, and it gets mixed with the hay and the manure over the course of the winter, and then you pull it out in the spring and then add it to your soil. And so that brings up, this is a way of charging the biochar. So as I mentioned, biochar is kind of an empty sponge. If you put it on just raw right after you produce it, but if you mix it with compost or manure in this case, it soaks up all of those nutrients, and then when you add that to your soils, it makes them more productive in many cases.
So I could put this in my chicken coop, is what I'm hearing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
That would work.
I wonder how they would like that.
It's been interesting. I don't really know. It's a good question with chickens, something we should look into. But in a lot of cases, animals will willingly eat it. The crews that I work with out in the woods, Lone Peak Fire Crew, have mentioned as they're coming back onto the job the next day after making char the previous day, they've seen, this is in San Juan County, they've seen deer eating the char and rolling in the char willingly. And the same story I've heard from many farmers with cattle when folks apply it to their open fields, cattle will choose to eat it. And our research shows that sheep will prefer it. And in some ways, maybe they know this ancient trick. When I traveled in Asia, when I had the winters off from firefighting back in the 80s, my doctor told me, take charcoal tablets with you. And if your stomach gets stodgy, eat the charcoal tablets. It'll absorb the bad things in your stomach and you'll pass them. And so this is not new. This is sort of ancient wisdom.
Yeah, that's interesting about the animals. I would definitely will not approach that here, but at another time that would be interesting to learn more about. So you mentioned about how biochar is kind of like a sponge, so it is absorbing the nutrients and then supplying those nutrients to the soil. So that sounds like it's pretty good. Are there is there a negative side to biochar when it comes to soil?
Well, it can be very expensive is one thing. And in some cases, especially as I mentioned, if you apply it raw, as an empty sponge, it will suck away some of the nutrients, some of the nitrogen and stuff out of your soil, and it can actually set your plants back in the short term. But usually in the long term, it's uncommon when that biochar would do damage to soil. In most cases, just adding carbon to the soil tends to be a good thing. Every time we till the soil, we lose some small percentage of the carbon, and many of our soils have been tilled many times over the decades. And here's a way to restore some of that lost carbon.
So I've got a few questions about biochar application and mixing it within the soil. Is there an optimum time of year for you to apply biochar? Does it need to be mixed into the soil, or can it just be spread over the surface?
My title is professor, so I get to say it depends. And it really does depend on a lot of things. We will use it in surface applications when we can't mix it into the soil, such as over certain field crops, which I'm not necessarily recommending, but if we're testing it on alfalfa, for example, we'll just top apply it. And if the pieces are small, say 1 millimeter or 2 in size, they'll work themselves down into the soil quite readily. Pretty quickly. It's pretty surprising how gravity and water will pull the char down into the soil. In most cases, it's not so much the time of year, but how you apply it. As I said, applying it to your compost pile first and let it soak up that compost, and then apply it to your soil in the spring, I think would be a better approach.
Is there an appropriate biochar to soil ratio?
Good question. Generally, we say about 10% is an ideal and pretty high amount of char. Any amount of char usually does good. What it tends to do is increase soil water holding capacity. Some research has shown that in forest settings, it can at that rate, about 10 tons per acre, or 10%, it can increase soil water holding capacity by 25,000 gallons per acre. thereabouts. And so from my perspective, we could almost turn some of our arid forest lands into water reservoirs by applying it on the soil. And so that's another way that we top apply it, is out in forest settings. And we just use pretty crude methods, the track hoe that we might be making it with, or the shovels if it's a smaller scale, and people and labor to just spread it out in the forest. And again, it tends to absorb into the forest floor within a period of a year or two.
Can you speak to some of the long-term benefits that biochar is supplying to the soil?
Sure. We get our biochar knowledge comes from the Amazon basin, the Terra Preta soils, where indigenous people, we thought there were no cities down in the Amazon, that they couldn't support themselves with large cities because the soil was so poor. That's why they do slash and burn agriculture. Then about 25 years ago, a Dutch agronomist is flying over the Amazon and he sees these straight lines down in the recently logged lands. And he goes down, inspects, and finds these huge embankments, many acres in size, of these so-called man-made super soils, or terra preta, where indigenous people 2,500 years ago mixed their charcoal with their pot shards and their compost and the local soils, and they made soils that are perhaps 7 times more productive than the typical Amazon rainforest soil. And people are mining those soils today for potting soils in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and other places. So there's a long-term impact, and more modern research shows that when we add biochar to soils, it's got a half-life of almost 1,000 years. So it's very durable. It moves around in the soil quite a bit. It can move off-site just through the mechanisms I mentioned. Gravity and water will carry it around, but that's okay. It's not really going to do much damage anywhere. And the more carbon we can get into our soil, the better off I think we'll be.
So what about in the forest? How does biochar provide benefits to the forest?
Well, from my perspective, in a variety of ways, it can sort of reduce fire danger in a couple of ways. One, when we make biochar, those hazardous fuels, then we're reducing hazardous fuels right off the bat. And with these methods, these simple kilns, we've reduced hazardous fuels in Utah by more than 50 tons so far, just with little demonstrations. So there's lots of different ways that we can use biochar in the forest setting. But so in this way, we've reduced just the initial reduction of hazardous fuels, but then that biochar, when applied to the forest soils, it should make that remaining vegetation more resistant to drought, and thereby more resistant to fire in the long run. So we've done the forest good in a couple of ways. And there's research independent of biochar that DeLuca and Applet have done that shows just charcoal from forest fires is really important to mixed conifer forests. So here's a way that we can sort of another way to simulate the positive effects of fire on the forest without all the risk.
So you mentioned hazardous fuels, which is just like the woody, in case there's anybody who's not sure, it's just the woody biomass that's laying on the forest floor that really isn't safe for anybody involved. So you mentioned pile burning before, and that's just putting all those hazardous fuels in a pile and lighting them on fire. So how is that different from using your kilns?
Good question. When we just burn piles, it's cheaper and it's quicker, no doubt. But all of that smoke goes into the air. Very small amount of that charcoal or carbon is preserved. And so it's kind of wasteful. And I like to sort of compare it to, when people in the woods tell me, oh, it's so wasteful, it's so much more expensive to make biochar in a kiln or in a hole. I like to compare it to, it was it used to be okay to burn leaded gasoline, but we decided catalytic converters and unleaded gasoline are a good idea. And this is a small, maybe that's a dramatic example, but this is sort of it's an example I think that applies a little bit. So it's a new way of doing things. It's definitely more expensive, but when we make biochar out of it in a kiln or even in a hole, if we do it in the right way, about a third of that carbon will be preserved. 2/3 of it will be used in the process, but it's, from my perspective, it's better to preserve a third than none at all. And again, if we just let that wood rot, all that carbon goes back into the atmosphere. The only real ways to preserve it is to make biochar or some other long-term forest product. You get hundreds of years perhaps out of a building when you put it into wood products, but we can get closer to thousands of years when we put it into biochar. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it sounds like biochar is kind of related to climate change, and could it possibly help us reduce the impacts of climate change?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's the most accessible way we can mitigate climate change, aside from conservation, driving less, that sort of thing. As far as a positive way of reducing the carbon in the air, and here's how this works. We put carbon in the air through fossil fuels burning and other burning of forests and that sort of thing. But trees take carbon out of the air. And as I said, if we let those trees, after they die, if we just let them rot, then that carbon goes right back into the air. But if we take those trees, we take the best of them, that third of the tree that will make a saw log, and we make durable wood products out of that third, and the other 2/3 that right now we're just burning up, we make biochar out of that, put that char into our soil. Yes, we can impact climate change in the long run. The man who coined the term biochar is Johannes Lehmann. I've had the pleasure and the opportunity of presenting at conferences and getting to meet with him. And he did a little sort of just a very rough calculation, completely academic exercise that showed that if all of agriculture worldwide readily embraced this biochar application idea, I'm not saying it's very practical, but if they did, we have the ability, I don't remember the number so much, but we can put more carbon in our soil than we've put in our air. In the next 30 years, we could put as much carbon in our soil as we've put in the air over the entire Industrial Revolution. And this is just kind of a back of the napkin calculation that he and some colleagues did. But it was printed as an editorial, I think, in Nature. So it holds a little bit of weight to me, and again, an academic exercise, but it goes to show that perhaps we could make a dent with this approach.
And that sounds pretty significant. So I'd say it's worth at least trying.
Yeah,
Let me play devil's advocate a little bit here.
Sure.
Is making biochar destroying our forests? Are we just going out there and cutting down live trees to produce this stuff?
Great question. I get this question occasionally, and an emphatic no. We're looking for ways to get rid of wood that we've already cut down, essentially. And it can be juniper trees that they've decided have expanded, and they're trying to grow grasses or reduce fuels to control fires around wildland urban interfaces, or the residue from logging, or there's lots of reasons that we have excess woody biomass out in the forest, and that's what we're trying to deal with. We're not, to my knowledge, nobody's cutting down trees to make biochar in particular.
That's good. That's good to hear. So do you have any examples of when biochar was successfully used as a soil amendment?
Yeah, there's lots of them. Some of the research we've done on tomatoes and melons, and this was not peer-reviewed research, but we did it here at the Utah Botanical Center a few years ago, and that showed a pretty good increase in the yield in tomatoes and melons. And there's so much research that shows a positive benefit, especially on specialty crops like that. I've also done research more recently. We right now are in the midst of publishing a piece that shows it doesn't do very much good for broad agricultural field crops such as corn and alfalfa here in Utah. We did apply biochar under irrigation pivots at 3 farms here in Utah. And between the cost and the extra, we didn't get much bang for our buck that way. It didn't do much damage, but it didn't do much good as far as yields. Probably does some good as far as carbon sequestration. And if we lived in a world where there were carbon credits, and we may live in that world someday where there's credits for preserving carbon, then it will start to make more economic sense on that scale, but it certainly does not at that scale.
Thank you. I have one more question for you before we jump into the questions that were submitted when people registered. If you could reduce hazardous fuels and make biochar anywhere in the world, where would you choose?
Well, I'm kind of excited to go back to Brazil to try to use some of my simple kilns there. I had the opportunity to present in Brazil, which, as I mentioned, is the home of biochar, at an international forestry conference 2 years ago, pre-COVID, and sort of made plans to go back and introduce my methods there and learn more about their methods. They make charcoal for other reasons these days, for steel production and for cooking, not so much as a soil amendment, but I think we can learn from each other. I'd love to go back to Brazil and make some char.
That sounds like it would be fun. Did you have any, I don't know if you wanted to show us a couple pictures or anything of your kilns, if you have any handy before
Sure,
we
let's see if,
part?
let's try and pull up that presentation. Let's go to share screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
So that's the Dragon Wagon I talked about earlier. This was our start in biochar production. Didn't make very much biochar, but it did make electricity. Here's a demonstration at the Kaysville Botanical Center, probably in about 2011, thereabouts. And so this machine in front of you, we put wood chips into and made electricity. And it was a lot of fun. It was a good way to get ourselves started down this road, but it wasn't that practical. It took all the attention of this person running it, who was extremely skilled individual, to keep it running. And we did have, as I mentioned, Utah's first wood-fired concert in Main Street in Beaver, Utah, and it powered a country rock band, and it was lots of fun, but it just turned out, I was hoping that a rancher or a farmer could use this to make electricity remotely for irrigation or some other remote purpose, but it took too much work. This is the pyrolysis machine. This is kind of, as I was working on that gasifier and got some help from this company, Amaron Energy, who owns this pyrolysis machine. So this cooks the wood also similar to the gasifier, but at lower temperatures, also in the absence of oxygen, and produces some gas like the gasifier, but also produces a lot of bio oil and biochar. And we were very interested in the bio oil. This is about 2013. We were working with this. But then in about 2014, the price of petroleum dropped so much that our bio oil became kind of useless. And so we started to focus on the biochar. We took that little machine and we made it mobile with Forest Service and BLM money and put it in this trailer. And here we are demonstrating it in Bingen, Washington on the Columbia Gorge, where we actually won a sort of a national gasification and mobile pyrolysis cook-off with some other teams. We competed, and that gave us impetus to scale this machine up to an even larger one. And this is the guts of that larger mobile pyrolysis machine that could handle 20 tons per day. That's about a truckload of chipped wood, and make really refined biochars. And here's that machine making biochar and bio oil in Nevada, in the Nevada desert, from pinyon juniper that was being cut for range preservation. And you can see my shadow in the bottom of the photo there, standing on the mountain of wood that we were pyrolyzing. But it wasn't that practical. And again, the price of oil dropped so dramatically. Here on the right, you can see this is actually an incinerator, is what those white boxes are. We're getting rid of the oil because at that point it became a liability. And I came to understand, or just the world changed such that the char, since the char was more valuable, that's what encouraged me to start using more simple means of biochar production. It's just a little picture of the char that we made. I wanted to share that we can also make a torrefied wood product as a coal replacement. We ran a test at the Hunter Power Plant. That's torrefied wood is just cooked a little bit less than biochar. Here's a picture of some of the wool that we made biochar from a few years ago. And here's a picture I wanted to share of our simple kilns. And this is where the direction I've moved in more, just stacking this wood up. And I've done more than 20 of these demonstrations in several states, and plan to do more this summer, possibly as far away as Minnesota, just tours showing people how to do that. I think, Gabrielle, you have some pictures of our big box kilns. If you wanted to share some of those.
Yes, I can do that while we are also diving into some questions, because we've got a lot and we've only got a little bit of time. So we're going to get through this little rapid fire round. We're going to do some questions that people submitted when they registered, and we'll do some that you guys have asked here during the webinar. So, do you think biochar could become a niche market for diseased woods?
Yeah, I think it's got that potential. I'm not really, I think in most cases, most of the disease will be cooked out of the wood. So biochar is already a niche market. So that would be a niche of a niche. And I think we're a little ways off from that.
Do you have any suggestions for sourcing hardwood to make biochar?
Oh yeah, talk to any sawmill. They usually have cut ends, and cabinet shops can also have a lot of material. And it can depend on how you're making the biochar. If you have crude methods, then you'll need bigger pieces like logs and sticks. If you have refined methods like the rotary pyrolysis kilns I showed, then you can start to use sawdust and wood chips.
Would biochar release chemical or metal elements into soil and be harmful to plants?
Generally speaking, no. As I mentioned, it's good to have your char tested and analyzed to make sure. But I haven't seen any cases where that's an issue. I've had characterized a dozen different kinds of char that we've made in a bunch of different ways here in Utah, and have not seen that problem. And in fact, have seen char sort of do the opposite. As mentioned, I participated in a study. A graduate student here looked at with some water quality experts, can we use it to pull pharmaceuticals and other unwanted things out of our water system? And in fact, we can.
That's interesting. Thank you. Is biochar production sustainable in semi-arid and arid regions where native vegetation is predominantly shrubby and grassy?
I think it depends how you produce the biochar. If you're using a lot of diesel fuel to drive your feedstocks long distances, then it doesn't seem that sustainable to me. But if you have more on-site abilities to make the char, then that would increase its sustainability from my point of view.
How do you determine how much biochar to add when you are planting trees? Small trees, like 1 to 2 inch caliper.
Oh, small caliper trees, I'd probably take probably a big yogurt cup as a rough estimate, as a practical way to approach it, and apply it to each planting hole. As I mentioned, a 10% mix is a common number that we shoot for. I hope those numbers are helpful.
So what about down in the Southwest? Are there potential biochar markets in this area? What's the availability like for biochar in the Southwest?
I'm so glad you asked, because we're hosting on April 7th through the 10th. We're hosting a biochar workshop. Opportunities in the Southwest is what it's called, and this will happen via webinar. It's over a 3-day event, and it's being organized by my colleagues, in particular my colleague from Arizona, an extension forester from there, Chris Jones, in addition to our colleagues, extension foresters from New Mexico and Colorado. So that will be the topic of that 3-part day event. Yeah, looking forward to that.
I'm super excited for that event.
Gabrielle is showing pictures of our big box kilns in action. So this is sort of my little contribution to the field. Can we do this in these large sort of dumpster-like containers? We've got a couple of them running here. I call them big box kilns. I've got a Utah Public Lands Initiative grant to make this happen here in conjunction with the U.S. Forest Service, the Heber-Camas Ranger District, the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest. This was in the fall, just this last fall, 2020, where we reduced, here we probably reduced hazardous fuels by about 50 tons over this 3-day period, burning the firewood pickers and the sawmillers had their way with these piles, and what was left was just going to be burned. So we made biochar from it. And we have 2 different kinds of kilns being demonstrated and worked with here. One is 16-foot long, the one on the right. The one on the left is 12-foot long. Call that one the BB12. One is double wall, one is single wall. And I'm working with colleagues from Oregon right now and here in Utah to further refine those designs to make them lighter and more portable.
Thank you. And I'm glad I was able to share those photos. Hopefully everybody enjoyed them as well. Can biochar help the WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface?
Yeah, I think it's a really practical place. You have to be very careful anytime you're using fire next to homes, but I've been successful in the spring and the fall, especially after, when there's good moisture on the ground, using kilns pretty much right next to homes, right next to people's gardens, next to people's cars, open fields, that sort of thing. So it's a pretty practical way to reduce hazardous fuels. I won't say no embers come out of the kilns, but I've experienced a lot I've done more than 100 kiln burns now, perhaps, and burned many thousands of piles, and embers come out of piles all the time and pretty rarely out of kilns. And embers is kind of how fire travels, and that's what you want to watch out for in that situation.
I guess at the end of the day, people just need to be sure that they're being cautious and watching the weather and making sure that they're only burning when it's appropriate to burn.
Yes, common sense, most important.
So if someone had a business and they wanted to start up production of biochar, what would you say an approximate cost would be for that?
Oh, the range is so tremendous.
Let's say small scale, like maybe municipal, like a small municipal.
They could start very small and very simply with big box kilns, especially if they were not in too urban of an environment, and they could use simple old dumpsters and get rid of a lot of their wood waste. And if they already had a composting operation, like such as here at the Logan facility, you could mix that in with your compost, and it could possibly be a win-win. If you're starting to get into higher tech rotary pyrolysis machines, opening bid tends to be about $500,000 for that type of technology, and many dumps will have the supporting equipment. So, but if you have no supporting equipment, such as front end loaders and the such, cost can increase dramatically from there. I'm not really recommending people go into the biochar business. I do recommend they try to adopt it on a farm and home scale where appropriate.
So this question is from Jean. I've heard that biochar has to be activated before using it for a soil amendment. What does that mean, and is this true?
I like that question. Generally, that is our recommendation. That means, going back to an earlier statement, biochar is an empty sponge. So if you mix it with soil, it could absorb nutrients directly from your soil. But if you mix it with compost and manure and fertilizer first and let it sit together for a while, it'll absorb that and make that available to plants. So that is what we call charging the char. Does that answer the question?
I think so, yes. Tracy would like to know what makes biochar different from regular charcoal.
In a sense, the name, we just call it if it's intended for soil. But if you're making charcoal, if you're buying Kingsford charcoal, that's often coal based. So that's completely different. If you're buying high quality, homemade sort of, or small made charcoal, that is pure wood charcoal, then it's very similar. We might, I've mentioned quenching. That's when we put the fire out at the end of the process. We fill the kiln with water, essentially. I might quench a little later for charcoal, essentially. Excuse me, I'd quench a little sooner for charcoal. I might leave some of those volatiles on there, where you don't want those volatiles when you're adding it to as a soil amendment. More or less, it's a name difference. And I have, to sort of back that up, after one of our big box burns here, our first one here in cooperation with the Logan Ranger District up Providence Canyon, just a few miles away, we pyrolyzed with the big boxes that day juniper that was cut as part of a wildlife improvement project. And then I went back in the evening and pulled up a bunch of the bigger coals and had some folks over to dinner that night and had juniper grilled, local juniper charcoal grilled chicken and salmon for dinner that I served. That came out pretty good. So it's kind of hoping that some of these, perhaps a farmer's an entrepreneur would come collect some of these coals that we're making on public land and sell at farmers markets and that sort of thing. This kind of reminds me of a story. Even before I was involved with biochar, I went to an extension conference where extension foresters compare notes and that sort of thing. And I was seeing a presentation from one of my colleagues in North Carolina. And there, if you're a real barbecue aficionado, you don't just make your own sauce and your own dry rub, but you make your own charcoal. And essentially, I had my first lesson on how to make biochar but it was all about charcoal for food cooking.
That's very artisan of you, very artesian. However, whatever, I don't know how to pronounce that word.
Artisanal, I think that's the word.
So John is wondering about contaminated wood. I believe that he may be the same person who submitted a similar question when he registered. So when you use contaminated wood to make biochar, does pyrolysis lock in those contaminants so that the biochar is uncontaminated, or is it too dangerous to kind of use things like railroad ties and utility poles?
I think that needs to be researched a little bit more. I think there's a lot of research available using perhaps Google Scholar. You could probably find a lot of research on that. We started to go down that road with Amaron Energy and started to research that. It seems very promising that using higher tech pyrolysis means, such as a rotary kiln with appropriate emissions controls, that would be a promising approach. I would not use my simple kilns for that approach. So it probably depends.
Okay. Karen would like to know, what do you think is the biggest missing bit of science about biochar that would lead to larger scale incorporation, such as to maximize carbon sequestration?
Yeah, it seems to me it's not so much about science, but about awareness, that most people have never heard of biochar, and there's a lot of science being done, and I think there's enough science done that we know how to use it and when to use it and when not to use it. And that if we had perhaps incentives, and I like to talk about, and this again is a pretty academic exercise, but in the back of these conference rooms, speaking with specialists from around the world, I've kind of come up with this little economic model of biochar for it to actually work. And there's 4 or 5 potential value stations in biochar originally when we reduce those hazardous fuels, as opposed if there was some incentive to make biochar out in the woods, as opposed to just burning up all that slash, then there's benefit there, whether there's incentive or not. There's some economic value. If we could find a way to count that as our first station, as our second station of economic value, perhaps we use that same char to absorb nutrients from, say, a water treatment plant that's putting too much phosphorus into the local watershed, such as the Logan. We're replacing, at the cost of millions of dollars, replacing our entire water treatment plant, like many other towns. I've worked a little bit indirectly with Ennis, Montana, who's having the same problem, too much phosphorus into the wetlands. So let's use that biochar to absorb those nutrients. And that actually adds value to the biochar. By charging it, adds that phosphorus and nitrogen. It will make it more, that charges the char, makes it available to plants. So then we take that same char that we sort of rented to the water treatment plant, we apply it to agricultural production. And so we've increased benefit that way by increasing our yield of our vegetables. And finally, as a fourth or fifth value station, we've sequestered carbon in that soil, and we've increased the water holding capacity. And there's no economic model that allows for all that. And maybe that's the answer to the question. The science of economics, how that could be applied to biochar in a way to make it more suitable, more palatable to people. Because right now it's very expensive to make and to purchase and to apply. So all of those things together.
Why are the big box kilns, that is a lot to say, open on top? Why are they not closed?
Good question, and easy for you to say. They can be closed. We start off with them open always because we want oxygen down in there. If you just started off with a closed system, you'd never get it started. And I referred to this a little bit. A lot of the wood on the outside and on the top is burning, and even on the outside of a log, it may be burning off, but charring what's at the inside of that log. And what happens, we call these big box kilns, and the smaller kilns tend to call them flame cap kilns, because pretty quickly when they're operating well, and you can see in most of the photos, it produces a cap of flames over the top of the kiln, and that disallows any oxygen, or limits the amount of oxygen that can come down. And the kilns are completely sealed on the sides and on the bottom, so there's no oxygen being pulled from there. And so in this way, that it limits the amount of oxygen down in the kiln. And we have lids for them. For some of them, we call them snuffing lids, and we'll use them at the end of a shift, or if we don't have water to quench the kiln, they can sometimes be useful. I'm still experimenting with those. Some of my colleagues have had better luck with the snuffing lids than I have had, but still learning about that.
Thank you. Let's see. Oh, there's so many. There are just so many questions. Does the energy input required to create biochar negate the carbon capture benefits?
It can. It depends on how you do it. If you truck that biomass for 70 miles before you pyrolyze it, then probably so. If you're doing it by hand out on your farm or in the back 40, then almost certainly not. So it kind of depends on the scale and the approach.
Do you always need to have water when you're making biochar?
Great question. It's best to have water when you're making biochar. It's definitely possible to make it. For one, you have fire theoretically out in the woods. At least that's my application. If you're in a field, then it's less of a concern. Having water, I always say when I do my workshops, have a charged hose. That's a hose full of water with more coming, ready to go in case you have what we call a spot fire in the wildland fire field, a little fire out of control getting started. So water is pretty handy for that reason. alone, but also you want water it's helpful to quench the fire afterwards. You can use a wet blanket or soil even, but it's just much slower and takes more work.
What about, is there a limit to the diameter of trees that can be processed?
Good question. I've not found that diameter yet. In our fancier kilns, we chip all the wood, so there's no limit there. In our big box kilns, as I mentioned, in the Camas district, we were burning logs up to 30-inch diameter, and they were pretty dry, but that's as big as logs tend to get in Utah on average. So if the wood is dry, it helps quite a bit. I've done cottonwood pretty large diameter like that as well. And I believe you could, with patience, you could go bigger. So not necessarily, there's not that much of an issue that way. If you had only 30-inch diameter logs and no sort of supporting, sort of kindling, so to speak, to get things going, it could be an issue, but I'm not seeing if you have a big enough box and you got enough fire going, you can handle the big logs.
At what point do you quench the biochar?
Good question. It can be when it's convenient at the end of shift. Often in practicality, I'm working with fire crews who are producing the char. We work 8 or 10-hour days, so we'll tend to quench just before lunch and just before end of shift. But in a lot of cases, we'll just let them go overnight if there's snow on the ground, and we're not worried about that. Ideally, though, when the kiln is about 3/4 full of coals, it gives you a little bit of room to stir things around. Or when you're out of feedstock, the mission is complete. Any of those times would be the time to quench.
Thank you. Everybody, I've launched a poll. If you could just take a minute to answer this for us, it's super helpful to our program, and it allows us to know that we're helping everybody out and getting down to business and doing a good job at that.
Yeah, I want to second that. Really important to fill out our polls. Thank you.
So I think we've only got time. We've got 4 minutes. So I have 2 questions that I have to ask at the end, but here's an interesting one. So we talked about terra preta soils and how they were making biochar in the Amazon. Is there any evidence of people using biochar, indigenous people using biochar in our region, in the Intermountain West?
None that I know of.
That would be interesting to dig into, I think.
Yeah, I mean, agriculture is pretty limited, but there's definitely the Fremont tribe are definitely agriculturalists, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if they did on a small scale, but that's a great question.
What is your favorite thing about working? No, we'll start with the bad first. What's your least favorite thing about working with biochar?
The administration portion of all the grants. I have usually 7 or 8 grants that I'm preparing, writing, asking for, and just how the bureaucracy that surrounds that is my least favorite, and some of the risk. So let's stay up at night. When you're burning stuff, it can be a little scary. Those are some of my least favorite parts of the job.
I'm going to ask the other part, but I was just scrolling and saw this question that I'm actually interested to know as well. Is biochar produced naturally as a result of forest fires?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and colleagues have shown that it's an important part of forest health that we have that charcoal in our forest. And
what is your favorite part about making biochar?
Oh, it's an exciting, fairly new field. I've been a forester for my whole career, and I love forestry, but this gives me something new to focus on that I just see as super promising. And I never really thought that I'd be in the position to maybe help with climate change a little bit, or have a tool that's readily available. And this is kind of a line I've created recently, that these simple kilns are the most accessible way to fight climate change, to put carbon in your soil right at home. There is no more accessible way. And to me, that's really exciting and a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for letting me torture you today. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it. I think we all learned a lot about biochar. I'll send everybody some information afterwards. Like we've got some really cool videos about biochar. We've got some articles about biochar. So I'll send you guys some really great information. If you have any serious questions you want to follow up with, feel free to email me and I'll cruise through the Q&A and see if there's anything else that we're able to address via email. But thank you again very much, Darren, for doing this
Thank you.
today. We really enjoyed having you and we really appreciate it. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you, everybody, for your attention today. Appreciate it.
Have a great day, everybody.